Hey guys, Matthew. In today's video, I'm going to bring you guys my starter for the upcoming 3.19 Lake of Kalandra League. So it is the same build that I've teased a couple times on my channel now, which is the Eye of Winter Minor Inquisitor. It's quite a mouthful to talk about. So what we're going to start this video with is basically a quick showcase of what the build looks like on its weakest point, which is mapping. A lot of people have been telling me, Matt, isn't miners like clunky? Isn't it very bad at map clearing, etc.? Now, there's a lot of things that we're going to be talking about in this video. There's a lot of mechanics that I need to explain. There's a lot of things I want to showcase. So it's probably going to be a pretty long video, so I would highly recommend you utilize the actual timestamps below if you are interested in only specific parts. Now, what I've prepared for you guys, other than the showcases, is a PoB which has all of the Lvling trees required, different setups for mapping and for bossing, and of course a custom filter which will make your experience very, very smooth while leveling the character. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do again is I'm going to start off by showcasing this build in its weakest point, which is mapping. So I'll just grab a random map here. Atoll is a pretty quick map, so that's not bad. So you'll see now this is on a mapping setup. So there's basically going to be two ways to play this build, if you will. A mapping setup and a bossing setup, right? So what I'll do here is we'll start with a mapping setup. It's going to be just a random T16, you know, out can go, whatever, it doesn't really matter. This build can actually do every single map mod, even things like no regen. It just means that you can't use your Righteous Fire. But again, let's just start with a quick showcase so you guys can kind of see what it looks like. Now, this is going to be a sort of budget which is not completely cheap, but it's also not excessively expensive, right? So we're rocking this thing which cost me 10 chaos in standard, a Blizzard Crown which I threw a couple essences at, this thing here which is basically just suppress in life. You won't anywhere near as much suppression on this shield in the upcoming league because we're getting a lot of suppression on the tree, but of course I'm just kind of making up for that. Right now I have way too much suppression, a little bit of suppression on the chest with some life, some resistance, so pretty basic stuff there. And then life and resistance pretty much everywhere else. Dark Ray Vectors are surprisingly good here because of the +1 max frenzy charge is good for both damage and also for how the build feels because of mine throwing speed. Pretty much the entirety of our mine throwing speed comes from this. Now, I'm going to be using chain support, which means my single target damage is going to suffer, but on the mapping version of this build, you can easily do things like 60% delirious map, T16 60% delirious maps with chain support, and it will still feel very good. All right, and of course, when it comes to the bossing setup, I'll be showcasing other things. So I'm not going to do the whole map. I just kind of quickly showcase what it looks like to map with this build, because a lot of people like to basically call this build like super squishy. A lot of people like to say that, you know, it's a slow mapper or whatever. Now it looks like my shield charging is not particularly great. But I kind of want to just showcase what it looks like. So it almost plays a little bit like a damage over time build, almost, in a sense that you're basically just going to be throwing mines and then they'll detonate behind you. Now you can see the single target. Obviously this is just this T16, so it's just going to instantly die. We are a miner. Even if this is a bossing setup or mapping setup, we still do quite a bit of damage. Now I have killed Maven on this setup, the mapping setup. Just because, you know, it's not that bad, but it's obviously nowhere near the sort of damage that you can expect from this build if you wanted to actually play it as a as a bosser, right? You can expect multiple times more damage than this, but this is just a bit of a showcase. Now, a lot of people are probably wondering, okay, Matt, but this is some pretty decent gear. What about early? What is my mapping going to look like at the very beginning of a league? So what I'm going to be showcasing here essentially is a quick map that I did after doing a leveling, a practice run. So I essentially got through the story. I got 10 maps. I basically crafted resistance on my white pieces of gear, made sure that I was resistance capped. Then we go from 2 scepter into scepter shield once we get to map. So I slapped on a shield that I bought from a vendor for like a few wisdom scrolls or whatever. And I use the recipe for +1 cold, which is basically 40% total quality of cold gems onto a scepter. This is going to give you a +1 cold scepter. I crafted, I regaled anything, and then I crafted spell damage. And that's essentially, that was my weapon. I was level 64, and I was doing yellow maps. And this is, of course, with unleveled gems, right? Level 12 or 13 or 14 gems, whatever it is upon reaching maps. Of course, this is utilizing EO, so we are not crit yet. We'll talk about that later when we get into the PoB. And of course, this is on a 4-link. This is not on a tabula, this is not a 5-link, this is on a 4-link, so SSF friendly, if you will, not a single item which you would not be able to get yourself. So you can see the sort of mapping. Again, this is a level 74, 71 area, so this is actually a T4 map, but I did do some yellows, and you can see like this sort of clear speed that it has. You know, it's a lot of people like to call this miners clunky, but I do think that if you just slap a shield and a scepter on it, it'll do more than enough damage, and it'll be very, very chill in terms of mapping. Now, we do run defensive auras initially, but we'll talk about that later on in the PoB section of the video. So yeah, again, like, it's not going to be the fastest mapping in the world, but when you compare it to a lot of other actual League starter builds, because it has a lot of single target damage, it's able to kill the bosses very quickly. And again, this is on a 4-link. It's actually going to make up a lot of the time that it loses through not being, say, something like Armageddon Brand Cremation. So yeah, it's a very smooth mapping experience. You never really feel like you're in danger too much, other than if you're just walking to, you know, big dangerous packs and you just don't do anything. But as long as you play it, like, you know, even just thinking of your positioning, you don't even have to use like mine sequencing. You'll see that I'm basically left click detonating here, which means I'm not getting any sequences or anything like that to help me get more damage on my mines. Then of course you'll see the boss of this T3 map in a bit. So I just wanted to quickly showcase what the build is going to look like upon reaching maps. It'll look something like this. This boss does take a little bit of time, so let me just skip forward a tiny bit. All right, there you go. So you can see now the boss, the actual boss of the map. So, you know, it's basically not quite instant, and I do believe that this map had suppression or something like that. It had a pretty tanky mod, and again, 4-link gaming. So obviously, if you throw in a 5th link, because our initial 4-link doesn't have any multipliers on it, it's basically just speed, because Inquisitor doesn't get any mine throwing speed, so we have to play charge mines. We have to go with swift assembly, so we're not actually getting any damage out of our links. We're just getting basically what makes it feel good. So a 5-link, you add in like anything, trap of mine damage, whatever really, and it's going to start feeling a lot better. Okay, now, of course, this build is a boss killer, so I wanted to showcase a little bit of what it can do in bosses. Now, this quick showcase here is going to be a feared encounter. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not an incredibly juiced up feared. This is a feared, which I believe was 35 or something quality, or quantity. It's basically just a blue feared, but this is on a day 2 setup for, you know, in terms of currency investment. So this is something that obviously you can go way further than that in terms of damage and whatnot. But I just kind of wanted to try it out. Like, can this build do the feared on a day 2 setup? I'll be talking about what I mean when I say day 2 setup when we get into the PoB, because essentially the items are the same. But just a quick showcase of what it looks like to do the feared on a very small budget for this build. Essentially, we're just going to one-tap the first boss, right? So there you go. The first boss is basically dead. It takes about 3 seconds to kill him. Then we're going to move on to the second boss. We're going to one-tap the second boss. And after that comes the little bit more sketchy part where we have to deal with multiple bosses at once, right? So here we go. Now, I did die, I believe, twice in this feared encounter. Once because I played really badly and I flame dashed into the balls from Shaper, so that was completely my fault. The other time I just got unlucky. Basically, I got slammed by Shaper and I flame dashed it, but then I got slammed again from the illusion, which you're about to see right now, which killed me because I did not see it coming. So yeah, just a quick showcase of the damage. This is the second time I died, and there we go. Again, it's not a juiced up feared in any way, shape, or form. It's just 35 quantity. But the fact that it can even do it on this sort of setup is definitely not bad for a League starter. Okay, now that the showcases are all done, you guys have seen what the build sort of looks like and what it can do. Now let's get into the actual PoB, which is where we have a lot of things to talk about. First off, let's talk about the actual Lvling trait and whatnot. So in the PoB, you can't see it because my face is hiding it, but there are many different trees. You'll see that basically there's all the Lvling trees here. So you can see exactly how to progress through the axe, how you're getting all the nodes that you're getting. Then we are going to make a swap from our Lvling build into your actual endgame build, which is Eye of Winter, after our first lab, right? So around level 31, 32 is when we were basically going to finish getting the RMR wheel over here, which is when we're going to be able to have enough mana to make the swap into the Eye of Winter setup. It's also around the time where you should have a 4-link ready to go, especially if you're using the filter, the custom filter that I made. It makes sure that you know when you do drop one, and that's when we're going to do that. Now, you'll see that there's something very important. There's a tree which is called level 40 Socket Poacher's Aim Jewel. Eye of Winter kind of struggles with clearing initially because the moment that it hits any enemy, the projectile stops, right? One way that we actually remediate to that situation is by getting the Poacher's Aim Jewel. Now, this is a free quest reward, which everybody gets in Act 5 upon completing the quest, which I'm about to showcase or show you guys right now. Once you go to the runed square, if you go down here, basically, and then you take a right, you'll basically get to this little mini boss. The quest is this one. Let's see. The quest is called I don't know why, but I can't see it. Sign of Purity, Temple of Eris, completing. Oh yeah, this one. The King's Feast is the name of the quest. You have to kill Utula, and then you're going to talk to Bannon, and he's going to give you this jewel here, which I think I may have equipped. No, I think I have a chain set up right now. I'll show you guys what the jewel looks like real quick. Pierce. Oops. Pierce. Alright, the jewel looks like this. It's called Poacher's Aim, and it gives you projectile pierce initial target. The moment you put this onto your build, it's going to start absolutely destroying in terms of clear, even in the story. I'm talking, you throw a few mines into a magic pack and it'll just be completely obliterated. So it's very important that you get this at level 40, which is also around the time where you get to that quest, where you complete the quest. So I made sure that you get the jewel socket pretty much exactly when you get the jewel, so you can put it on as soon as you get it. Then we're going to go to level 50. We're going to grab a ton of cold damage on the tree, like a lot of cold damage. And this is because we want our Frost Bomb, which is something that we use in order to proc Onslaught on the build, to do enough damage to kill white packs of monsters in order to give us Onslaught while we are leveling through the story, so that we can have a very smooth sailing through this through the actual storyline, the campaign. Then we are going to go ahead and get the RMR here. Now, the reason why we get this RMR early and why we prioritize it is because the moment we get this RMR, we are going to drop Herald of Ice, and we're going to go with the defensive aura, which is going to be Determination. This is going to make it so the rest of the storyline, now that you'll have Determination, is going to be very, very easy. You'll feel very, very safe, especially paired with the amount of regen that you get from simply being an Inquisitor. This is also around the time where you're going to get your second lab, which is Pious Path. This is going to allow you to run Righteous Fire permanently if you feel like you want the damage. If you don't want the damage, you can just, instead enjoy the regen. However, the moment you get Pious Path, as long as you're capped on fire resistance, you need absolutely no regen anywhere on your tree, just Arrogance and Vitality, something I'll talk about later once we get into the notes, and you'll be good to go. The build feels really, really strong at that point. Then comes level 60. We're basically going to start going towards the suppression and frenzy charges, which is very important because that's where we get our throwing speed in this build. Then comes level 75. Around level 75, we are no longer going to be able to get carried by EO. So we are going to drop a lot of nodes around here and some of these cold damage nodes, and we're going to start grabbing some crit nodes instead. So that's when we're going to grab the crit stuff here, the crit stuff there, the power charges, and that's when we go essentially crit on the build, as we are going to be able to get more damage out of that. And of course, also because we're going to be freezing everything, so your mapping is going to be very, very safe, as you're going to be freezing pretty much the whole screen all the time. Then around level 81 or so, I assume you're going to get your Uber Lab around that point. We are going to make a few final more changes to the tree, where we're going to go Eldritch Battery and Mind Over Matter. Now, this is a question that I get all the time. Why EB and Mom? Why do this? Why did I make that choice? So, Mind Over Matter essentially allows you to take a portion of your damage as mana instead. As you can see, this also allows us to very easily run Righteous Fire later on in the campaign, but we don't need it early on. So this makes it so you're taking damage from mana. Now, this is also getting buffed to 40%, which means the build is taking 10% less damage in the upcoming patch. So that's a buff. Now, the problem with Mind Over Matter is that you need a lot of mana, right? If you don't have mana, then that's a problem because Mind Over Matter is just gonna, the moment you get hit, it's just gonna drain your mana pool, and then you're just gonna be sitting there doing nothing, right? Well, the thing is, we can kind of cheat our way through that using Eldritch Battery, which this makes it so your energy shield protects your mana instead of your life. Now, you would think that by utilizing this, what happens is it drains your ES, and then it drains your mana, and then you're stuck there doing nothing. But the thing is, because it protects your mana, and your mana actually doesn't take damage, unlike your life pool, your Eldritch Battery makes it so your recharge rate on your energy shield is constantly going up. It never stops. It's not like if you were an ES build and you take damage, and then you need to wait for your energy shield to start going back up. It's instant. Now, another cool thing about that is because of Pious Path, which gives you Consecrated Ground you create causes life regeneration to also recover energy shield. It means that you are basically constantly, pretty much always, at full energy shield and therefore at full mana, which means you don't have to worry about mana cost, which is something which is really, really annoying on a miner, especially early on in the game. You have a lot of mana issues because mines actually, they don't only cost mana, they reserve mana. So they reserve mana, and then once you blow them up, they're no longer reserving mana, but there's nothing that's actually going to recover that mana for you to be able to use them again. This bypasses all of that nonsense and makes it a very, very chill gameplay. As you can see, my energy shield here, it's going down a little bit, right? I have no mana anymore because once I throw all my mines, I reserve all of it, but I can still do everything. I can still use any of my abilities. And the reason for that is because my energy shield is allowed me to cast all these abilities, and because the recharge rate is never stopping, it's always full essentially, which allows you to use things like Frost Shield for free, allows you to use things like Zealotry or whatever aura that you want on a Divine Blessing, which is something that you used to be able to do by utilizing Life Tap to make it so it costs life, but instead now it costs energy shield, so it's basically free, right? You don't have to actually pay the cost of using the Divine Blessing. So there's some very, very nice upsides to EB plus Mind Over Matter. Okay, finally, you'll see that the level 91, which is where I stopped the tree, there's two different trees. There's a bossing setup and there's a mapping setup. The mapping setup is basically where you're going to get more pierce. You're not going to get the staff nodes, as you're going to be mapping with a shield and a scepter. And basically, that's mostly the biggest change there. And you're going to drop some suppression on the tree. You're not going to need as much suppression on the mapping setup because you're going to be able to get suppression on your body armor, suppression on your shield, stuff like that. So you're going to get some extra nodes instead. Now, the bossing setup is a little bit different because on the bossing setup, which is a little bit more expensive. So typically that makes sense because you're going to start with the mapping setup. It's very cheap, easygoing, SSF friendly. You're going to make some currency to be able to afford the bossing setup so you can go into bossing, which is something you'll do more at the end of the game, right? Maven, Ubers, etc. So that's when you're going to go into the bossing setup, which is, again, a little bit more expensive. The biggest change here is that we're going to go with the Skin of the Lords, or Skin of the Loyal, which means we can't get suppression on our body armor. And another thing is we can't get suppression on our shield because we're going to use a staff. This means we need to get more suppression on the tree, which is why we're getting Instinct. We are also getting the suppression spelled if your boots, helmet, and gloves have evasion. This does mean that when we are gearing up, we'll want to make sure that our gloves, our boots, and our helmet have suppression. Now, this is very easy because our endgame boots for the bossing setup is going to be at 0 step. It offers a ton of suppress, decent life, and also decent evasion, which these things don't really matter. Talk about that when we go into the skills portion of the tree. But yeah, they have evasion. Another thing is the best possible helmet on a budget for bossing is a Blizzard Crown until you can afford a Devouring Diadem. Blizzard Crown comes with some energy shield as it's a hybrid, so you're going to easily be able to worry about that there. And then the last thing is basically you'll have to make sure that the gloves that you get have some evasion on them so that you can enable that mastery. Once you do that, you'll basically be completely capped on spell suppression, which is very important for bossing. Even if you have no other real defenses, that alone is going to carry your actual bossing survivability a lot, paired with Immortal Call, tons of regen, 40% Mind Over Matter, which is essentially like saying 40% less damage taken by default, right? Any damage you take is literally 40% less. So these are things that make you very, very tanky, despite the fact that you look at the PoB and you're like, wow, I have 30,000 EHP. I must die all the time. Well, I'm doing 60% Delirious T16 maps, deathless, and I don't even feel like I'm in danger. Why is that if I've got no defenses? It's because PoB numbers don't tell the whole story. Okay, now let's talk about, now that we've talked about the items, let's go ahead and talk about the actual links. You're going to find two different setups in there. Obviously, when it comes to Lvling, that's in the notes, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So in terms of the skills, you're going to find a bossing setup with the staff, where essentially you're going to be using these links. Now, the biggest difference is that because the staff comes with a massive reduce elemental resistance debuff, it's very hard to get enough resistance to cap out. And we need to have capped fire resistance at the very least in order to use Righteous Fire. The other ones you can have slightly under cap, but I would highly recommend capping them out. So the easiest way to do that is to go Purity of Elements. Now, Purity of Elements means that you need to give up an aura, which is going to be your defensive aura, which is why the bossing setup is indeed going to be squishy, right? The mapping setup, not so much. It actually is quite tanky. We're still going to run the Divine Blessing, and then our Frost Shield is where we're going to get a lot of our crit on the bossing setup. The mapping setup is not going to need the Frost Shield to actually cap out its crit nearly as much, but the bossing setup does need Frost Shield, which makes sense because for bosses, you're pretty much going to want to stand still, put your Frost Shield on top of yourself, and just mine away. We'll talk about the playstyle in a little bit in terms of how to maximize DPS output. And then for the mapping setup, it's going to be slightly different. You'll see that there's two different cast when damage taken setup. You get to choose one. Either you go Immortal Call or you go Molten Shell. Essentially, you go Immortal Call if you go Grace, you go Molten Shell if you go Determination. You're still going to run Righteous Fire with Flame Dash. We're still going to run an Arcanist Brand for debuffs. And then another change that you're going to have to choose one of the auras. Either you go Grace or Determination. Now, because we need suppression on our gear, it means that we're getting some dexterity gear, right? Some evasion. So personally, I like Grace more, but you can also go Determination if you want. And then you have a Divine Blessing, and then the same thing in the Frost Shield, right? So that's pretty much covers it for the PoB. Now there's a full Lvling guide with exactly the links, when to change them. You know, everything you need to know is essentially there. The recipes so that you can make the rings, so you can make the scepter crafts. There's even a regex. Now, if you don't know what this looks like, or what this is, a regex, essentially you're going to copy paste this in the vendor windows, and it's going to make it very easy to find things that you need. The right links, the right colors, move speed on your boots, etc. So if I take this regex here and I just simply copy it, and I talk to Tarkly in Act 1, under highlight items, if I paste this, you'll see that it's going to start highlighting items. This is just a way for me to allow you guys to essentially get an easier access to vendoring, so you can save some time. As you can see here, for example, we get blue, blue, green. We get blue, blue on gloves. These are perfect items that would be fantastic, you know, early on in the game. So this should help you guys a little bit. The vendor recipes, all the links, when you swap them, what gems you get in which acts. Pretty much everything you need to know about the Lvling is going to be available in there. Now, you'll find a link in the description of this video, which is essentially my filter blade link. Basically, when you open it, it'll look like this. All you have to do is load this Eye of Winter custom Lvling, and then you can basically, once you've loaded it, you can just download it, or you can sync it to your actual PoE profile. It's up to you which one you do. Note that you probably don't need to do that yet. Well, you might want to do this if you want to do some Lvling practice, as it's a custom Lvling filter. It stops at level 60, which means upon entering Blood Aqueducts, you'll want to swap this filter. It's no longer going to show anything. It's no longer going to filter anything. The moment you get to Blood Aqueducts, you swap out of this and you go to your actual filter, which is where I'll personally go into like a Chaos Recipe filter. So yeah, that's what you want to do there. But yeah, you'll definitely want to update that filter on the day of the league start when Filter Blade is updated, because obviously there's going to be some changes and it might break the filter if you're trying to use the old version. But I'll make sure that that's updated on the day of the league. Okay, that's pretty much everything I have to talk about in terms of this build, other than playstyle is the final thing I want to talk about, and essentially why I made the choices that I made. So we're going to look at the mapping setup, but it's going to be essentially the same for the bossing. Frost Shield is essentially there to give us defenses. It's really nice, but also is there to give us base critical strike. If you look at my offense here on Eye of Winter, you'll see that I have 50.28 critical strike chance, right? Now, if I throw some mines, this is going to go up to 56. If I throw on my Frost Shield, this goes up to 71. It's a massive deal. So you want to be using Frost Shield in single target scenarios. It's also going to make you significantly tankier. So that's something you want to keep in mind. Now, Vitality and Arrogance is what allows you to run Righteous Fire permanently without degenning. You'll see that if I turn off my Vitality, I'll start degenning. Maybe not a lot, but I will start degenning. Well, I guess I don't, but I normally should. It's probably just because of my Hardy Anoint, but that's not what I have in the PoB, so if I take this off, you'll see that I actually do start degenning for real this time. So yeah, that's what allows us to run Righteous Fire, especially early on. And the thing is, Vitality is not a percent-based aura. It's a flat-based aura. So the advantage of that is that by linking it to Arrogance, it's actually not going to reserve much. It only reserves a couple hundred life or a few hundred life, and therefore it's not going to make you feel significantly squishier, like if it was like a 10% aura, which was basically once you link it to Arrogance, which has a 200% cost multiplier, it's not going to reserve like 20% of your life. It's just a very tiny amount. Okay, now Immortal Call, cast when damage taken, obviously could be Molten Shell. It's up to you, as I was previously mentioning. Righteous Fire is just a damage multiplier. Now, we don't actually deal damage with Righteous Fire. The reason why we use Righteous Fire is because of this line that says grants 39% more spell damage. It's just a big buff. It's basically like having an extra support gem. Instead of being on a 6-link, we're on a 7-link, essentially. Flame Dashes are a movement ability. Now, you'll see that we don't get Arcane Surge linked to our Flame Dash like most builds do. And the reason for that is because Eldritch Battery means we never actually use mana. We use Energy Shield. So the way that we get Arcane Surge is through our medium cluster here. Arcane Pyrotechnics, which is 10% more damage for Arcane Surge. So you'll definitely want to be getting this ASAP. However, it's not like you need it when you start mapping. It's something you'll want to get, when you get into yellowish or red maps. You could just alt spam with nothing else, just Arcane Pyrotechnics. Now, what I would recommend is using Speed Reforges from Harvest. That's going to be the easiest way to get both of these, as Guerrilla Tactics has a speed tag. And that's going to be, the easiest way other than just alt spam Regal. But again, you don't need Guerrilla Tactics. It's just a quality of life node. You just need Arcane Pyrotechnics. All right, now that that's out of the way, let's keep going. Divine Blessing, Inspiration, and then an aura of a choice, either Zealotry or Hatred. Pretty much just depends on how much crit you have. This is just a free aura. You do have to click it every 10 seconds, but when you do press it, it is going to give you a pretty massive amount of DPS. Now, there's a bit of a cast time to this, which means you probably don't want to macro it or anything like that, because if you do, you're constantly just going to be getting stunned by it, if you will. But for single target damage, you pop this, then you pop your Frost Shield, and then you're basically nearly doing double the damage. It's a pretty big deal. Bear Trap is another, a little debuff. Bosses take about 15-20% more damage when you throw it on top of them. It's not a necessity. Like, if you'd rather have just a portal gem or something like that, you really don't need this damage. It's mostly a bossing thing, but I threw it in there anyways. Arcanist Brand is what's going to actually debuff for us, which means that we don't have to debuff ourselves. We use Assassin's Mark on the mapping setup because we don't need the crit other than on single target. And for the bossing setup, we use Sniper's Mark. These are all things that are in the links in the PoB. And then Flame Wall is a big damage. It adds a lot of flat damage to our build. So that's what we actually use. It's better than, say, Tornado, for example, or Hydrosphere, because we don't benefit from reduced resistances as we are Inquisitor, which means Inevitable Judgment just takes care of all that. And finally, we have, for the mapping setup, our movement abilities, so Shield Charge, Faster Attacks. Now, the cool thing about Shield Charge, Faster Attacks is that it doesn't scale that much off of attack speed. It scales off of movement speed. So you'll see that right now, my Shield Charge is pretty slow, but in maps, once you actually have Frenzy Charges, which obviously gives you some more speed and whatnot, and Onslaught and all that, you'll be Shield Charging quite fast. And then our auras, either Grace or Determination. I personally like Grace, as we're getting, again, some evasion or gear already, and then Summon Skater Bots. Now, in terms of the playstyle, which is pretty much the last thing to talk about, you'll pretty much just, it's pretty much a one-button build, if you will, because you hold down left click, which is going to detonate mines for you, and then you can just right-click to throw the Eye of Winter, and that's going to take care of all your mapping needs. Like, there's nothing else you really need to talk about there. For single target, you'll want to basically put your Arcanist Brand, pop your Zealotry or your Divine Blessing aura, throw on your Frost Shield, then you'll want to throw all your 15 mines at once, and then you'll want to detonate one single time, because that is going to cause a large chain of detonation, and every single mine in that chain does 5% more damage than the previous one. So let's say you can get like a chain of like 30 mines, you can see that it gets pretty crazy. You'll see a massive ramp up on single target if you do that. However, for the mapping setup, we don't go with that's for bossing. For mapping, we actually just go with high impact because we don't use the staff. The reason why we go Blastchain when it comes to the staff is because Annihilating Light gives you triple damage. Now, triple damage and double damage don't stack. Triple damage is just going to take over, which means if you're to use high impact, which gives you 2% double damage per mine near the enemy, would literally do nothing. It would be like a wasted support. So instead we go Blastchain Mine, which allows us to get these long sequences for that much more single target damage. Now that's pretty much it. I'll have another video probably day 2, day 3, day 4 of the league in terms of how to go further into the actual investment on the build. You know, start looking at large cluster jewels, start looking at, you know, devouring items, stuff like that. I haven't really had time to PoB this stuff yet, but a little bit later into the league, I'll have a video showcasing how to basically further the build to push it to where it can really just one-shot Ubers and all that good stuff, as I truly believe that this build is capable of doing every single boss in the game, even some super juiced up ones. Matter of fact, with the Annihilating Light Day 2 setup that I showcased earlier in the PoB, I was able to do Uber Shaper, Uber Elder, Uber Cortex, Uber Maven, and Uber Eater. The only two that I wasn't able to do is Uber Searing, because the Annihilation was a problem. Now, I think that if I had a Rise of the Phoenix in a shield swap for shield charge, I would have been able to do it just fine, because I wouldn't have gotten killed by that ability. And then Uber Cyrus, because Uber Cyrus is just an absolute shitfest. Basically, all the stuff on the ground stops your regenning. It's just an absolute pain. So this build is not great for that. But pretty much anything else, 100% deli maps, you know, pretty much everything outside of things that require a really big area clear. Like, for example, you know, Legion farming would not be the best for this build, but things like blighted maps, stuff like that would be absolutely perfect. Anyways, that's pretty much it for the build guide. All the links that I talked about are going to be in the description down below, so feel free to check that. Also use the timestamps if there's anything that you need to listen to again. Before I go, as always, I do want to say a massive thank you to all my supporters: Alex, the other Alex, the third Alex, Katie, Bearded Ape, Brandon S, Gustavo, Tim, Domo Same Desu, Nis, Draw Loophole, Mercury, Nike, Patrick, Rascol, Bert, Rocky, Solomonk, the Great Master, Thomas Mass, as well as Maestro, Nailid, Caesar, Bitizen, Nectarian, Noi, Xethrion, and Larsus. Appreciate all the support. Hopefully this league starter is going to be very successful for you guys. I personally have been having an absolute blast, just destroying everything in the game with it. So hopefully it's the same for you all. Anyways, I'll see you guys in another video. Peace.